The letter was written in pencil, 11 pages, torn from a navigation log aboard a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. The handwriting is uneven, words crowding the margins, some sentences crossed out and rewritten, the lines slanting as if the writer's hand was shaking, or the surface underneath was moving, or both. The man who wrote it was 32 years old, a naval officer with a decade of training in the management of nuclear weapons systems, and he wrote it sitting on the pitching deck of a Soviet rescue vessel in the North Atlantic, with his submarine still visible on the horizon, going down. His name was Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Belikov. He was the missile section officer for tubes 3 through 6 aboard K-219, which meant he was one of the officers responsible for 4 of the 16 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles the boat was carrying when it caught fire and began to sink on October 3, 1986. He sealed the letter in a waterproof chart sleeve he had taken from the navigation station. He gave it to his wife, Irina. He told her to keep it hidden until he was dead, and not to show it to anyone before then. He was dead within 18 months. Cardiac arrest, officially, at the age of 33. For 38 years, the letter waited. It waited under the floorboards of an apartment in Gadzhievo, then in a safety deposit box in Murmansk, when Irina moved after her husband's death, then in the hands of an archivist at the Murmansk Regional Archive, who came very close to classifying it as a duplicate naval document and destroying it. In February of 2024, Irina Belikova decided the time Nikolai had asked her to wait for had finally come. She contacted the archive and released the letter to its Cold War naval collection. By April, researchers cross-referencing the letter's contents against SOSUS hydrophone tapes declassified in 2023 had confirmed something that neither Moscow nor Washington had ever officially acknowledged. The story of how K-219 died was wrong, not in minor details. Wrong in ways that define what the Cold War almost became on a gray October morning, 600 miles northeast of Bermuda. There are 3 questions at the center of this story. Why did the silo seal fail after it had already been isolated by an experienced officer following correct procedure? What was in Torpedo Tube 4 when K-219 surfaced, and what orders were given about it in the minutes after the explosion? And what decision did Captain Igor Britanov make in a flooding command post at 0617 Moscow time? A decision that no one above him in the Soviet chain of command knew he was making. A decision that may have prevented a nuclear detonation 600 miles off the American East Coast. Nikolai Belikov wrote the answers down, in pencil, on 11 pages of a navigation log, and gave them to his wife to hold for 38 years. This is what he wrote. To understand what Belikov recorded, you need to understand the boat. K-219 was a Project 667A Navaga submarine, commissioned by the Soviet Navy in 1971. NATO gave this class of vessel the designation Yankee I. She was 130 meters from bow to stern, displacing 9,400 tons when submerged. In practical terms, she was a city block of steel designed to lurk in the Atlantic for months at a time, maintaining a credible threat of nuclear retaliation against the United States. Her existence was the point of mutual assured destruction. As long as Soviet submarines were positioned close enough to American cities that retaliation was guaranteed, the theory held that no rational actor would initiate a first strike. The missiles that made this theory work were the R-27 Zeb. 16 of them, stacked vertically in silos arranged in 2 rows along K-219's spine. Each missile carried a single nuclear warhead. A submarine like K-219, properly positioned, could strike the American East Coast in under 12 minutes from the moment of launch order. The R-27 was a liquid propellant missile, and that matters for what happened on October 3, 1986. The missile's fuel system used nitrogen tetroxide as an oxidizer and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, UDMH, as a propellant. Both substances are highly toxic, highly corrosive, and violently reactive when they come into contact outside their sealed containment systems. The reaction produces dense orange-brown gas, heat, and if concentrations reach ignition threshold, explosive pressure. Western navies had abandoned liquid propellant submarine missiles for exactly these reasons by the 1960s, transitioning to solid fuel systems that were chemically stable, easier to maintain, and far safer in the enclosed environment of a pressure hull. The Soviet Navy had not made that transition. The R-27 and its successors remained liquid-fueled, deployed on second-generation submarines like the Project Navaga class, because the development timeline for solid fuel replacement systems lagged, and because the weapons already in service were performing their deterrent function adequately enough that replacement was repeatedly deferred. K-219 had been in service for 15 years by the autumn of 1986. Her missile fuel systems had been maintained on the schedules the Soviet Navy mandated. But schedules are executed by people, and people work within resource constraints that the schedules don't reflect. Classified reports from the Soviet period, partially released after 1991, document fuel seal irregularities aboard K-219 on at least 2 previous patrols, not catastrophic failures, not immediate emergencies, but readings outside normal parameters that were logged and assessed and did not generate the maintenance responses they warranted. This is how systems fail, not suddenly, but incrementally, as the gap between what the documentation says was checked and what was actually checked narrows a little further each cycle until the margin is gone. Captain First Rank Igor Britanov commanded K-219 on her final patrol. He was 40 years old in the autumn of 1986, a 2-decade veteran of submarine service, technically meticulous, reliable in the ways the Soviet Navy required its commanders to be. He knew his boat's history. He knew the missile section's maintenance record. He departed Gadzhievo Naval Base on the Kola Peninsula on September 4, 1986, with 119 men and 16 missiles. Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Belikov had been serving under Britanov for 2 years by that autumn. In his letter, he describes their professional relationship with characteristic precision. The captain trusted his officers to manage their sections, and in return, he expected to be told clearly and quickly when something went wrong. In the Soviet Navy of 1986, this expectation was less straightforward than it sounds. Aboard every Soviet naval vessel, there existed a parallel command structure in the form of the zampolit, the political officer, whose role combined ideological supervision, crew morale oversight, and the management of information that could, if transmitted incorrectly, prove politically inconvenient. On K-219, the zampolit was Captain Third Rank Vladimir Petrenko. Petrenko's own account of October 3rd, given in a Soviet television documentary broadcast in 1990, contradicts Belikov's letter on nearly every material point. He described the crisis as a technical accident: fuel leak, explosion, evacuation, sinking. Steady command decisions, tragic outcome, no particular mystery. He did not mention the torpedo in Tube 4. He did not mention the acoustic contact report. He described Britanov's decision-making as professional, under difficult circumstances, and ultimately unsuccessful in saving the boat. Petrenko's account has been the primary Soviet narrative of the K-219 incident for more than 3 decades. Belikov's letter suggests he had specific reasons to tell the story that way, and that those reasons had nothing to do with the actual sequence of events on October 3rd. I spent weeks going through the full documentary record on K-219 before writing this. The 1991 Soviet Board of Inquiry transcripts, the CIA assessment produced in 1988, the SOSUS declassification package released by the National Archives in 2023, the survivor accounts that appeared in various Russian and American publications in the 1990s. There is a great deal of material. Almost all of it converges on the surface facts: fuel explosion, flooding, loss of the boat. It diverges significantly when it comes to sequence, decision-making, and the specific events of K-219's final 3 hours on the surface. Belikov's account is internally consistent and technically coherent. He describes procedures correctly, uses accurate terminology, and provides specific detail that could only come from direct observation. Whether it is definitively the truth is a question historians will continue to argue. What it is, beyond any doubt, is the most detailed first-person account that exists from inside those events. So let's go inside. October 3rd, 1986. K-219 was running submerged at depth, positioned at approximately 32 degrees north latitude, 65 degrees west longitude, in the open North Atlantic, roughly 600 miles northeast of Bermuda. Sea conditions were moderate. The patrol had been routine for nearly 4 weeks. At 05:24 Moscow time, Senior Lieutenant Belikov was on duty in the missile section. He noticed a pressure reading in the monitoring system for Silo 6 that had drifted outside its normal range. Not by much. The automated alarm threshold had not been crossed, but it was outside the parameters, and Belikov was not a man who logged anomalies and waited to see what happened next. He notified the watch officer at 05:24. The watch officer passed the report to the officer of the watch. The officer of the watch passed it to the executive officer. At 05:32 Moscow time, Britanov was notified. Those 8 minutes between 05:32 and 05:40 are where the official record and Belikov's account first diverge. The difference matters because everything else follows from it. The Soviet Board of Inquiry, reporting in 1991, concluded that Britanov's initial response to the Silo 6 anomaly was insufficiently decisive. The board found that he delayed the order to ascend and surface while additional assessment of the situation was conducted, and that this delay allowed the developing pressure failure in Silo 6 to worsen beyond the point where isolation could contain it. This conclusion formed the core of the negligence charge brought against Britanov in 1987, the charge that he lost his submarine through inaction. Belikov writes a different sequence, and the difference is specific. He writes that Britanov's first action upon receiving the Silo 6 report was not to order additional assessment, and it was not to begin the ascent to the surface. His first action was to order Silo 6 isolated. Physically isolated, the technical procedure aboard Project Navaga submarines that involves closing the propellant feed connections to a designated silo and sealing its access hatches from the missile section. The procedure requires 2 officers with the correct authorization codes. Belikov was one of those officers. He states in the letter that the isolation procedure was initiated at 05:34 and completed at 05:38, 4 minutes. At 05:38, Silo 6 was sealed. By every procedure that governed missile section management aboard a Soviet submarine, the situation was contained. The silo was physically isolated from the rest of the missile section. The propellant feed connections were closed. The hatch was sealed. The seal failed anyway. This is what the SOSUS data, Declassified in 2023, adds to the record. The sound surveillance system was a network of hydrophone arrays anchored to the Atlantic seafloor, maintained by the United States Navy throughout the Cold War, to track Soviet submarine movements by their acoustic signatures. The SOSUS tapes from October 3, 1986, had K-219 in acoustic contact for the duration of her patrol, and they capture an event at 05:48 Moscow time, 10 minutes after Belikov recorded the isolation procedure as complete. The technical characterization of that acoustic event in the declassified analysis is precise. An implosive pressure pulse, followed by a sustained low-frequency resonance, consistent with pressurized liquid fuel containment failure in an enclosed metal compartment. In plain terms, the silo seal broke. Inside Silo 6, nitrogen tetroxide and WDMH, which had been building pressure against aging seals for 15 years, were now in direct contact. The chemistry is rapid. The reaction produces heat and a dense, highly toxic orange-brown gas. If concentrations reach ignition threshold in an enclosed space, the result is explosive overpressure. At 05:51 Moscow time, 13 minutes after the isolation was recorded as complete, and 3 minutes after the SOSUS acoustic event, the explosion occurred in Silo 6's lower access compartment, where the fuel feed connections ran. The force blew the silo hatch partially open and sent a pressure wave through the adjacent missile section spaces. 3 sailors died in the immediate vicinity, overcome by propellant fumes before they could reach the emergency breathing equipment stored in the missile section. Seaman First Class Karpachev, 19 years old, managed to get his hands on an OBA, an oxygen breathing apparatus, but was badly burned before he could get it properly on. He died the following day. Belikov was not in the immediate explosion area. He had moved forward of the missile section after completing the isolation procedure and was in the corridor running alongside compartment 6 forward when he felt the blast transmitted through the hull as a concussive pressure wave. He writes that he began moving aft immediately, and that even from the corridor he could see the leading edge of the orange-brown gas propagating through the forward boundary of the missile section. He writes that he was stopped in the corridor by Petrenko, who was moving forward from the direction of the command post. Petrenko told him there was an American submarine in the area. This is the moment on which Belikov's entire letter turns. Not the explosion. He describes the explosion in detail, but without particular emphasis, because the explosion was a technical event, and technical events have technical explanations. What Petrenko said in that corridor, 3 minutes after the blast, with toxic gas beginning to spread through the compartment behind Belikov and dead men in the aft section, that conversation has no technical explanation. It is a human event in the middle of a mechanical catastrophe. and Belikov records it with an exactness that suggests he understood immediately that he was watching something that needed to be documented. The common understanding of this incident, the one in the books, in the documentaries, in the encyclopedic accounts, does not mention this conversation. It proceeds directly from the explosion to the damage control response to the decision to surface. What Petrenko's contact report meant in context, and what Britanov did with the information, are entirely absent from the official record, because what Britanov did was arm a torpedo. The Type 5365K was the standard wake-homing anti-ship torpedo, carried by Project Navaga submarines in their forward tubes as a defensive weapon. K-219's Tube 4 was loaded. A wake-homing torpedo, once armed and fired, follows the acoustic wake of a target vessel and detonates against its hull. It does not require a precise firing solution. It does not require line-of-sight contact. It requires an approximate bearing to a vessel that is moving through the water and leaving a trail. At 06:02 Moscow time, 11 minutes after the explosion and 8 minutes after Petrenko's contact report, Britanov ordered Tube 4 armed. Belikov was on the boat's internal communication circuit when the order was given. He was in the missile section assessing the spread of gas into the adjacent spaces, monitoring through the communication circuit, because it was the only way to track what was happening in other compartments. He writes that he heard the order clearly. He writes that Britanov's voice was steady and precise. He writes that he understood at once what the order meant, and that he said nothing. What was there to say? What's most surprising about this sequence, looking at it from outside, is not that the order was given. You can construct a logic for it. A crippled Soviet nuclear submarine with 16 ballistic missiles, flooding, with toxic fumes spreading forward, a crew dying, and an American submarine in the area. In the strategic context of October 1986, with Cold War tensions at a level not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the presence of a U.S. vessel near a damaged Soviet SSBN was not a benign data point. The trailing of Soviet submarines by American attack submarines was standard practice, and it occasionally produced close encounters that both navies preferred not to acknowledge publicly. What's surprising is what happened 15 minutes later. Every theory of nuclear deterrence, mutual assured destruction, strategic stability, first strike calculations, operates at the level of governments and general staffs and decision trees that assume rational actors with accurate information and time to think. None of that applies to what was happening in K-219's command post at 06:02 Moscow time. Britanov had approximately 8 minutes of information about the American contact before he gave the Tube 4 order. He had a flooded missile section, dead men aft, toxic gas spreading forward, a reactor running with degraded cooling, and a political officer standing in his command post telling him an enemy submarine was within weapons range. He made a decision. The framework that was supposed to prevent nuclear escalation had no mechanism for reaching inside that moment and making a different decision for him. He made it himself. At 06:14, 12 minutes after the arming order, Britanov came to the forward command post. The damage control situation aft was being managed by the most experienced men available, working in improvised breathing protection, wet rags, OBAs on shortened rotation schedules, whatever could be organized. The boat was in a controlled ascent toward the surface. The immediate crisis was not contained, but it was not accelerating. Britanov stood in the command post without speaking for a moment. Belikov, who had come forward from the missile section to report on the gas situation, was at his monitoring station. He writes that he looked up and saw Britanov standing there, and that Britanov's face had the expression of a man who had arrived at a decision and was thinking through the weight of it. Then Britanov said, and Belikov records this as a direct quotation, "If we fire that and miss, we will have started a war with nothing left to fight it with." He ordered the torpedo in Tube 4 de-armed at 0617. The de-arming sequence for the Type 53-65K required confirmation from 2 officers and took approximately 6 minutes. It was completed at 0623. The torpedo in Tube 4 was returned to storage status. K-219, a crippled nuclear-armed Soviet submarine 600 miles off the American coastline, was no longer in a position to initiate a military engagement. Britanov turned back to his chart. Belikov writes that after the de-arming was completed, Britanov went to the navigation table and stood looking at the chart for a long time. He writes, "I do not know what he was looking at. 11 words in an 11-page letter, written in pencil on a pitching deck. That sentence has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in the document. People who write crisis accounts, incident reports, inquiry testimony, survivor memoirs, they lie about facts sometimes, or misremember them, or shape them to fit the narrative that makes sense afterward. They almost never fabricate small, inexplicable observations about human behavior. Those details survive because they happened, and because the writer couldn't not record them. K-219 surfaced at 0712 Moscow time, 1 hour and 41 minutes after the explosion, 49 minutes after the torpedo was de-armed. The boat came up into a gray October Atlantic, with 3-meter swells and rain beginning to fall from a low overcast. She sat low in the water, visibly damaged, her aft section uninhabitable, her port reactor showing elevated temperatures. 116 surviving crew members were doing what they could with what remained. Britanov transmitted his situation report to Fleet Command at Gadzhievo at 0720. Fleet Command's response took 40 minutes to arrive. When it did, it was not an order to abandon ship and secure crew safety. It was an order to attempt to save the boat, protect the classified systems, recover the encryption materials, preserve the missile section if at all possible. The Soviet Navy was ordering Britanov to fight for a vessel that could not be saved, for reasons that had nothing to do with the men still aboard her. The obstacle that made Fleet Command's order operationally impossible had a name: the reactor. The VM-4 naval reactor in K-219's aft section had been operating since before the explosion, with its primary cooling flow disrupted by the hull damage. Nuclear reactor cores require continuous active cooling to maintain thermal equilibrium. Without adequate cooling flow, core temperature rises. The rate of rise depends on the reactor's power level and the degree of cooling degradation. In K-219's case, the reactor had been running at reduced power since the explosion, which slowed the temperature increase. But by approximately 1100 Moscow time, roughly 5 hours after the explosion, the readings had reached a threshold that forced a decision. Britanov could attempt to maintain reactor operation with degraded cooling, betting that the damage control teams could restore flow before temperatures went critical. Or he could shut the reactor down manually. A running reactor provided electrical power to the boat's damage control and communication systems. A shutdown reactor gave them nothing to work with, except battery power, which was limited. Britanov ordered the manual shutdown. He needed 2 men to execute it. Sergei Preminin was 20 years old, a naval conscript from Vologda Oblast in the Russian north, in his first year of submarine service. He was, by every account in the historical record, calm and capable under pressure, the kind of young sailor who could be given a task in a bad situation and could be trusted to see it through. He would go aft with Lieutenant Nikolai Smirnov, the reactor section officer. They went through compartments that were no longer fully habitable, wearing emergency breathing equipment, carrying the tools the shutdown procedure required. The VM-4 manual emergency shutdown involved physical manipulation of the control rods, one by one, in sequence, to quench the reaction. The procedure had to be performed in proximity to the reactor core, in a space where the ambient temperature was elevated and the radiation environment was outside normal operational parameters. Smirnov was overcome by fumes before he could complete his portion of the procedure. He was extracted. Preminin continued alone. He completed the reactor shutdown at approximately 11:15 Moscow time. The reactor temperature stabilized and began to drop. The aft thermal emergency was over. Preminin then attempted to exit through the connecting hatch to the next compartment forward. The hatch would not open. The hull distortion from the explosion had warped the frame, and the differential pressure between the water-infiltrated aft spaces and the comparatively higher pressure of the forward sections had sealed it from his side. He pushed. He tried the emergency release mechanism. He pushed again. He called forward on the communication circuit and told them the hatch was stuck. The men on the other side began working on the hatch. Britanov ordered everything available brought to bear on it. Crowbars, hydraulic tools, organized pressure from multiple men. None of it moved the hatch. The sea conditions were worsening. Soviet rescue vessels had arrived and were taking men off K-219. The evacuation was proceeding as quickly as the weather allowed. Britanov was among the last officers to leave. Sergei Preminin did not leave. He is listed in official Soviet records as having died in the performance of his duty. He was awarded the Order of the Red Star posthumously. In 2002, He was named a hero of the Russian Federation. A school in Vologda Oblast bears his name. A missile frigate in the Russian Navy is named Sergei Preminin. He was 21 years old when K-219 went to the bottom. The official account of his death, in the Board of Inquiry, in the historical literature, in the citations for his posthumous decorations, describes him as a hero of a technical accident, a brave young sailor who gave his life, containing a fuel leak disaster. Belikov's letter makes him something different. It makes him a hero of what actually happened that day. A near-nuclear incident on a boat that had been 3 hours from a potential military engagement with an American submarine. On a boat whose captain had armed and then de-armed a weapon in the space of 15 minutes. On a boat where the decision not to start a war had already been made before the reactor crisis began. Preminin shut down that reactor to contain a situation that was itself the aftermath of a choice. One version of his death is a maintenance disaster. The other is a different kind of story. Here's a take that will probably draw disagreement. The Soviet Navy's decision to order Britanov to attempt to save the boat, to make the preservation of classified equipment the priority over crew safety once the primary crisis was stabilized, is the operational failure that caused the unnecessary deaths in K-219's final hours. The explosion was a failure of material maintenance and institutional neglect of known risk. The Torpedo decision was a crisis management situation that Britanov ultimately resolved correctly. But the hours between surfacing at 0712 and the boat's final sinking 3 days later, the hours during which men were sent back into dying compartments to recover documents and protect systems, those deaths were institutional. They were a command culture's answer to the question of what a Soviet sailor's life is worth, compared to a submarine's secrets. Britanov was court-martialed in 1987 on charges of losing his submarine through negligence. He was acquitted in 1988. K-219 sank on October 6, 1986, 3 days after the explosion. She went down in 5,500 meters of water, more than 5 kilometers beneath the surface, in the North Atlantic, approximately 680 miles northeast of Bermuda. The coordinates are in the record. She is there now. The 16 R-27 ballistic missiles remain in their silos. The 2 VM-4 reactors remain in their reactor compartments. Sergei Preminin remains in the reactor section. In the years since the sinking, the wreck has been surveyed by American research vessels, by Russian vessels, and by joint expeditions during the comparatively cooperative decade of the 1990s. The most recent comprehensive radiological survey, conducted by a joint research team in 2018, found no significant evidence of active radioactive leakage at the wreck site. The reactors appear to remain structurally contained. The propellant seals on the missile silos, nitrogen tetroxide, and UDMH, sealed inside corroding metal at 5 kilometers depth in salt water, have not yet produced a detectable chemical plume at the surface. The word "yet" is doing significant work in that sentence. Nuclear engineers and marine chemists who have looked at K-219 specifically are not comfortable with the timeline question. Pressure hulls corrode on a schedule that can be modeled but not predicted precisely. Seals degrade. The gap between current structural integrity and failure is, at 5 kilometers depth, essentially unmonitorable in any meaningful real-time sense. The 2018 survey showed that catastrophic failure had not occurred yet. The next scheduled survey will show the same, or it will not. The wreck is in international waters. No nation has practical jurisdiction. No mechanism exists to intervene, even if intervention were somehow possible. What do you think? Is this a problem for the international community to treat as urgent, or has 40 years of non-leakage effectively made it someone else's burden to inherit? Comment below, because serious people have seriously different positions on this, and the gap between what's technically possible and what's politically feasible at K-219's coordinates has only widened since 1986. Igor Britanov retired from the Soviet Navy in 1992 and has lived in St. Petersburg since. In the years following the Soviet Union's collapse, he cooperated with documentary filmmakers, gave interviews, and worked with at least 2 authors who produced book-length accounts of the K-219 incident. He was careful and precise about what he confirmed. He confirmed the explosion, its timing, its location. He confirmed the evacuation and its sequence. He confirmed Preminin's heroism in terms that left no ambiguity about his respect for the young sailor. He confirmed, when pressed directly by at least one interviewer, that the Board of Inquiry's official timeline was inaccurate in certain respects. He never mentioned Tube 4. Not once. Across 30 years of speaking publicly about K-219, Irina Belikova decided in 2023 that the right time had arrived. The specific trigger was learning about the SOSUS declassification, the fact that the American acoustic record had been released into the public domain, that it now confirmed a second vessel in the K-219 patrol area on October 3, 1986. If the Americans were finally allowing their hydrophone data to be read by researchers, then the gap between the American account and the Soviet account was no longer a matter of one side's word against the other. She contacted researcher Yevgenia Petrova, a retired signals intelligence analyst from the Murmansk Institute of Marine Research, who had been cross-referencing the SOSUS data against Soviet naval records for over a year. Petrova was the one who first found the specific discrepancies in Petrenko's 1990 television account, 17 points of contradiction with the data available from other sources, the most significant of which involved the timing of the American contact report. Petrenko placed it after the decision to surface. Belikov places it before. That difference in sequence changes everything about the context in which Britanov ordered Tube 4 armed. In the weeks after Irina delivered the letter to the Murmansk archive, two men came to her apartment. They did not identify themselves. They asked to see what she had given the archive. She told them the archive held the rights to the document and suggested they make their inquiry there. They left. She has not been contacted again. She told Petrova, "I waited because Nikolai asked me to, and because I didn't want to cause trouble for people who were still living. But the people who needed protection from this letter are almost all gone, and the people who should know what actually happened are still here." Petrova's analysis of the letter, cross-referenced against the SOSUS data and the 1991 Board of Inquiry, is scheduled for publication in Morskoy Sbornik, the Russian Naval Journal, later this year. October 3, 1986. 3 hours. 1 torpedo. 15 minutes. Britanov ordered Tube 4 armed at 0602. He de-armed it at 0617. In those 15 minutes, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, flooding, on fire in its aft sections, with men dead and dying, held in its forward torpedo room the nearest thing to a first strike that the Cold War ever produced in the open Atlantic. The American submarine in the vicinity, never officially identified, never officially acknowledged, did not know what was happening in K-219's torpedo room. Fleet Command in Gadjievo did not know. Moscow did not know. Washington did not know. Only Britanov knew. And the officers on the internal communications circuit, who heard the order given, and then heard it rescinded, and Nikolai Belikov, who wrote it down in pencil on 11 pages and gave it to his wife. The Cold War is full of these moments, we now know. Incidents buried in classification, sealed away by what both sides needed to never admit. We know about the 1983 Petrov incident because Petrov eventually talked. We know about Able Archer because intelligence services on both sides eventually released the documents. We know about the Norwegian rocket of 1995 because the alert system worked exactly as designed, and someone had to explain afterward what was decided and why. K-219 almost went on that list in a different way. It wasn't managed by systems or protocols. It was managed by one man's judgment in one moment, in a command post no larger than a closet, with no protocol for what he was facing and no time to find one. He made the right call. That fact lived in 11 pages of penciled navigation log for 38 years, because the man who wrote it down understood that the world would eventually need to know. If this story has changed how you think about K-219, or about the margins on which the Cold War ran, there's more where this comes from. Deep Blue Warfare covers the undeclared history of naval operations, the decisions made below the level where official histories record them, the incidents that almost became something else, the men who made calls no system anticipated. Subscribe and turn on notifications. What's coming next is a story from a different ocean and a different era, a decision that took even longer to surface. Comment your take below. Britanov did not fire. Does that make him one of the most consequential figures of the Cold War's final decade, or just a man who, in the end, made the only rational choice available to him? The answer is less obvious than it looks. We read every comment.